The story does not begin with explosions lighting up the sky or soldiers charging across battlefields. It begins in rooms that rarely appear in war films. Quiet offices, long wooden tables, ledgers stacked high, ceiling fans turning slowly as clerks move ink across paper. Outside, the world is burning. Inside, numbers are being arranged. While World War II tears through Europe and Asia, another kind of war unfolds in silence. It is fought with balances, credits, and promises. In this war, India does not stand as a front line. It stands as something far more valuable. It becomes a vault. Across the Indian Ocean, ships move in steady lines. They leave ports heavy with grain, textiles, metals, and machinery. They carry uniforms for distant soldiers. They carry raw materials that feed factories thousands of miles away. They carry the labor of millions who never leave the subcontinent, yet fuel a global conflict. These ships do not sail under the banner of plunder. They sail under contracts, under wartime necessity, under the language of duty. This is not conquest in the old sense. No gates are broken. No treasuries are smashed open. Everything appears orderly, legal, controlled. On paper, India is paid. Ledgers record compensation for every shipment, every service, every sacrifice. The numbers grow larger each year. The balance sheets suggest prosperity. They suggest participation. They suggest fairness. But the reality beneath those numbers tells a very different story. The money does not arrive. The wealth does not circulate. The payment is delayed, deferred, locked behind rules that India does not control. It exists only as an entry in someone else's book. Think about that. An entire country is financing a global war without consent, without authority, and without access to its own earnings. This is not looting with bayonets. It is extraction through systems, through currencies and credits that look harmless to the untrained eye. This is how modern power operates. Quietly, efficiently, invisibly. The official story is simple and reassuring. The war is framed as a shared struggle against tyranny. Every sacrifice is necessary. Every delay is temporary. India is told it is part of something larger, part of a moral fight that justifies hardship. The language is patriotic. The tone is urgent. And urgency has a way of silencing questions. Who controls the payments? Who decides when compensation becomes real money? Who bears the cost while the war drags on? Behind the speeches and declarations, a different story is unfolding. It is a story about leverage, about who holds a pen that defines value, about who decides whether wealth is usable or merely theoretical. In this hidden war, India's resources flow outward, while its ability to act inward grows weaker. Food leaves the country even as hunger spreads. Industrial output rises even as local purchasing power erodes. The numbers say one thing. Daily life says another. This is where the stakes become clear. This is not only about money. It is about food security in a time of global scarcity. It is about financial sovereignty under colonial rule. It is about the future of a nation already strained by decades of extraction. The war does not create this system. It accelerates it. It provides cover. Emergency becomes justification. Delay becomes policy. And policy becomes habit. Most people do not notice what is happening. That is the brilliance of the system. There are no dramatic seizures to film. No single moment that feels like theft. Everything happens gradually, month by month, ledger by ledger. The damage accumulates in the background, hidden behind the noise of war headlines and battlefield maps. Attention is drawn to where the bombs fall, not where the balances grow. Inside India, the effects begin to ripple outward. Prices creep higher. Essentials become harder to afford. Wages struggle to keep pace. For many, the war feels distant yet strangely present. The sacrifices are felt at the market, not the front. Families are told this is temporary. That victory will make it worthwhile. That the books will be settled when peace returns. Few are told who will decide the terms of that settlement. The idea of compensation becomes abstract. What does it mean to be paid if the money cannot be spent? What does wealth mean if it exists only as a promise? These are questions that do not fit neatly into wartime propaganda. They do not inspire enlistment. They do not rally crowds. So they are pushed aside, left to economists and administrators who understand exactly how dangerous they are. The silence surrounding the system is not accidental. It is structural. The mechanisms are complex by design. Currency arrangements, exchange controls, deferred payments. These terms sound technical, even boring. That is their strength. They discourage scrutiny. They create distance between cause and effect. By the time consequences appear, the origin is already buried under years of paperwork. This is how a country can be drained without anyone calling it theft. This is how extraction can wear the mask of cooperation. India's role in the war is praised. Its contributions are celebrated. Its people are thanked. Yet the fundamental imbalance remains untouched. Control rests elsewhere. Decision-making rests elsewhere. The war economy does not belong to India, even though it runs on Indian resources. Imagine standing in one of those offices. Outside, news arrives of battles won and lost. Inside, clerks quietly record another shipment sent, another credit added. The numbers rise. The vault grows fuller on paper. But the key is not in Indian hands. It never has been. Every entry deepens a dependency that is difficult to see in real time. This is why the plunder remains silent. It does not announce itself. It does not shock. It normalizes itself. Each transaction feels small. Each delay feels reasonable. The logic of war demands patience. The logic of empire demands obedience. Together, they create a system where questioning feels disloyal, even dangerous. The tragedy is not just that wealth is extracted. It is that the extraction is framed as necessity, as inevitability, as the cost of being part of the world. That framing dulls resistance. It reframes exploitation as responsibility. And responsibility, once accepted, becomes a powerful chain. As the war intensifies, India's role becomes even more critical. The empire leans harder on its resources. The ledger entries grow faster. The promises pile higher. The gap between paper wealth and live reality widens. Yet the system continues, largely unquestioned, because it has been built to avoid attention, to function smoothly, to look fair. The central question lingers beneath every shipment and every signature. How do you plunder a country without firing a shot? How do you extract wealth while claiming partnership? And perhaps most importantly, why does almost no one notice while it is happening? The answer lies not in villainous acts, but in structures, in rules written long before the war begins, in a global order where control of currency means control of outcomes, where power does not need to shout, it only needs to record. By the time the war reaches its peak, the consequences of these decisions will no longer be abstract. They will appear in empty markets, strained systems, and a growing sense that something is deeply wrong. But in this opening moment, the illusion still holds. The books balance. The war effort moves forward, and India continues to give, believing the reckoning will come later. This chapter is about that illusion, about the moment when silent plunder hides in plain sight, about a war fought not only with weapons, but with accounting entries that will shape a nation's future long after guns fall silent. To understand how the silent extraction became possible, the illusion of strength must be examined carefully. On the surface, British India during World War II looked formidable. Railways stretched like iron veins across the subcontinent, moving goods with mechanical precision. Ports pulsed with activity, cranes lifting cargo day and night. Factories hummed, producing uniforms, ammunition, machinery, and supplies at an unprecedented scale. From the outside, it looked like an economic giant fully mobilized for war. Efficient, reliable, indispensable. This image was not accidental. It was cultivated. The empire needed India to appear strong, stable, and productive. The war effort depended on it. Britain framed India as the backbone of imperial logistics, the silent engine that kept global supply lines alive. Newspapers spoke of contribution and unity. Officials spoke of shared destiny. India was not presented as a colony being drained. It was presented as a partner standing firm against a common enemy. But this strength was carefully managed, even staged. The infrastructure that impressed foreign observers had been built to serve imperial needs long before the war began. Railways did not exist to connect Indian markets efficiently. They existed to move raw materials from the interior to the ports. Ports did not serve Indian trade priorities. They served outbound flows. Factories did not develop balanced industrial ecosystems. They filled specific wartime gaps determined elsewhere. India supplied raw materials at scale. Cotton, jute, steel, coal, and food moved outward continuously. Millions of Indian soldiers were recruited, trained, and deployed far from home. Their labor-powered campaigns across continents. Their wages, like so much else, were tightly controlled within imperial systems. This vast contribution created the impression of participation. It suggested that India was part of the decision-making structure. In reality, it had no seat at the table where priorities were set. The illusion of strength depended on one central idea. Productivity equals power. India was productive, therefore it must be strong. But productivity without control is not power. It is vulnerability. The more India produced, the more essential became, and the more leverage the empire gained over it. Wartime urgency amplified this dynamic. Every shortage elsewhere became a demand placed on India. One of the most important aspects of this illusion was currency. India did not control its own money. Its currency system was tied to imperial authority. Decisions about exchange rates, settlements, and reserves were made outside the country. This meant that even as India generated enormous economic value, it could not decide how that value was stored or used. Wealth flowed outward in real terms and returned only as accounting entries. During the war, this system intensified. Britain faced severe financial strain. Traditional sources of payment were exhausted. Gold reserves dwindled. Foreign exchange became scarce. Instead of reducing demand, the empire adjusted the mechanism. India would be paid not in cash, but in credits. Promises to be settled later. Numbers added to accounts in London, not money circulating in Indian markets. On paper, this arrangement looked reasonable. Wartime disruptions justified temporary measures. After all, the war would end. Settlements would follow. Everyone would be made whole. That was the narrative. And it worked because it sounded logical. It sounded fair. It sounded temporary. In practice, these credits were unusable. India could not freely convert them into goods or services it needed. It could not deploy them to stabilize prices or invest domestically. They existed as frozen value, locked behind imperial control. Imagine earning a wage you are not allowed to spend. Imagine being told you are wealthy while struggling to buy essentials. That was the reality hidden beneath the balance sheets. The illusion held because the system was legal and orderly. There were contracts. There were procedures. Nothing appeared stolen. Everything was documented. That documentation became a shield. Critics were told the books were balanced, that compensation existed, that patience was required. And in a time of war, patience was framed as virtue. Meanwhile, local realities deteriorated. Wartime demand pulled resources outward faster than local systems could absorb. Grain shipments increased even as food security weakened. Transportation prioritized military logistics over civilian needs. Industrial output surged, but profits flowed through channels that did not return to Indian hands. The visible signs of activity masked the invisible drain beneath. This imbalance was reinforced by language. Officials spoke of mobilization and contribution. These words implied agency. They implied choice. But there was no meaningful choice. India could not refuse demands made in the name of war. Colonial authority ensured compliance. Economic necessity ensured silence. Resistance was framed as irresponsibility in a time of global crisis. The system appeared unstoppable because it functioned smoothly. There were no sudden collapses, no obvious breaking points. Each year followed the last with increasing intensity. Production targets rose. Credits accumulated. Inflation pressures grew quietly. The structure rewarded obedience and punished disruption. Those inside it often believed it was simply how things worked. For many Indians, the war economy felt distant yet intrusive. Factories expanded, but living standards did not improve. Work increased, but security did not. The promise of future settlement became a constant refrain. After the war, after victory, after peace, always later. Never now. This is how extraction survives. It hides behind complexity. It buries itself in technical terms that discourage challenge. It frames itself as necessity rather than choice. And most importantly, it aligns itself with a moral cause so powerful that questioning feels wrong. Who would challenge wartime sacrifice? Who would ask for payment while others fought and died? Yet this moral framing masked a structural truth. The war effort did not create equality. It deepened hierarchy. Decisions flowed in one direction. Value flowed in one direction. Control remained firmly in imperial hands. India's apparent strength was built on compliance, not sovereignty. Even the growing balances themselves became part of the illusion. Officials could point to rising figures and claim prosperity. Look at the numbers. Look at the contribution. Look at the wealth being generated. But numbers without access are not wealth. They are claims. Claims that depend entirely on the goodwill of the one who controls them. As the war progressed, the gap between appearance and reality widened. India looked indispensable, yet increasingly constrained. Productive, yet increasingly fragile. Integrated into the global war economy, yet denied the tools to protect its own stability. The very efficiency that impressed observers made the extraction easier, smoother, and harder to detect. Think about the paradox. The more India proved its reliability, the more it was leaned on, the more it delivered, the more it was asked to sacrifice. Strength became justification for further extraction. There was no endpoint to find, no clear limit, only the promise that once the war ended, balance would be restored. This illusion could not last forever. Systems built on imbalance eventually reveal their cost. But at this stage, the machine still runs. The ports still hum. The factories still glow at night. The ledgers still grow thicker. And the idea of partnership still holds, even as the foundation beneath it begins to crack. This chapter is about that illusion, about how productivity was mistaken for power, about how order disguised extraction, about how a system can look unstoppable precisely because it is designed to avoid visible failure, and about how, in the middle of the greatest war the world had ever seen, one of its most consequential economic battles was being fought quietly, far from the front lines, hidden behind the appearance of strength. Every system built on imbalance eventually begins to expose its cost. At first, the signs are subtle, almost easy to dismiss. During the middle years of the war, India's economy starts to feel heavier, strained in ways that numbers on official ledgers fail to capture. Prices rise slowly, then faster. Basic goods cost more each month. Wages lag behind. For ordinary people, the war no longer feels distant. It is felt in markets, in ration lines, in the shrinking space between income and survival. Inflation becomes the first crack in the illusion. Money exists, but it buys less. The same rupee that once covered families' needs now falls short. This is not accidental. It is a direct result of how the war is being financed. Britain, under enormous pressure, expands its money supply to pay for Indian goods and services. India absorbs that currency without the corresponding control over supply or spending. The burden shifts quietly. Britain funds the war. India pays the price through rising cost of living. This is the core mechanism of silent extraction. It does not require force. It relies on control of currency and settlement. Britain issues payment in the form of credits. India receives currency that circulates domestically, pushing prices upward. The real value of what India provides declines, even as the nominal figures rise. On paper, balances look impressive. On the ground, purchasing power erodes. As the war drags on, this erosion accelerates. The demand for resources does not slow. In fact, it increases. More grain is required. More raw materials are needed. Transportation networks prioritize military shipments. Civilian supply chains are stretched thin. In some regions, shortages deepen into crisis. Food becomes scarce. Speculation spreads. The poorest feel the impact first, but no one is untouched. The idea of shared sacrifice begins to fracture under pressure. People notice that scarcity is not evenly distributed. Resources are leaving even as local needs go unmet. The explanation remains the same. The war demands it. Victory requires it. Settlement will come later. But later keeps moving further away. Indian administrators and leaders begin asking questions that cannot be answered with slogans. If India is earning so much, why are reserves inaccessible? Why does compensation exist only as a figure recorded elsewhere? Why must every domestic adjustment be justified, while external demands face no such restraint? These questions do not challenge the war itself. They challenge who controls its economic consequences. The answer, increasingly clear, lies in power. Control of settlement means control of timing. Control of timing means control of reality. If payment can be delayed indefinitely, then the cost is carried by the one who cannot wait. India cannot wait. Its population cannot wait. Inflation does not pause for peace negotiations. War urgency becomes a perfect shield. Emergency justifies exception. Exception becomes routine. What began as a temporary wartime arrangement hardens into a system of dependency. Each year, a delay normalizes the idea that India's earnings are not truly its own. They belong to the empire until the empire decides otherwise. This is a turning point. Not a single event, but a growing awareness. The realization that India is not merely contributing to the war effort. It is underwriting it. Britain is fighting on credit, and India is a lender that cannot demand repayment. Think about the irony. A colony financing the survival of its ruler. An empire projecting strength while relying on resources it cannot immediately pay for. The war exposes a fundamental truth that peace had obscured. Imperial power is no longer absolute. It is sustained by deferred obligations and borrowed value. As this understanding spreads, the language of partnership begins to sound hollow. Contribution without control feels less like duty and more like exploitation. The gap between what is promised and what is delivered becomes impossible to ignore. The illusion of fairness collapses under the weight of lived experience. At the same time, the technical complexity of the system becomes more visible. Currency controls restrict what India can import. Exchange rules limit flexibility. Even when goods are desperately needed, access is mediated through imperial approval. Economic sovereignty remains out of reach, even as responsibility continues to pile up. The strain shows in every corner of the economy. Infrastructure is pushed beyond its limits. Labor is stretched thin. Rural and urban pressures collide. The war economy demands constant output, but provides no cushion against its side effects. The system extracts value while offering minimal resilience in return. What makes this moment decisive is not just economic pain. It is clarity. The war strips away comforting myths. It reveals that control, not contribution, determines outcomes. That legal frameworks can mask injustice. That numbers can lie without ever being false. The realization changes how India sees its position in the world. The war is no longer just a distant struggle between empires. It becomes a mirror reflecting the cost of dependence. The idea that wealth earned will automatically translate into power is exposed as fiction. Without control over currency, settlement, and timing, wealth is fragile. This shift in understanding does not immediately stop the system. The war still rages. The demands continue. But the psychological balance has changed. What once seemed inevitable now appears imposed. What once seemed cooperative now appears coercive. As the conflict nears its later stages, Britain's financial weakness becomes harder to hide. Deferred balances grow too large to ignore. The empire survives, but only by leaning harder on the same mechanisms. Each delay deepens the contradiction. Victory depends on a system that reveals imperial decline. For India, the cost is cumulative. Years of inflation, shortages, and constrained autonomy leave lasting damage. The war does not just extract resources. It reshapes expectations. It teaches a painful lesson about the true nature of power in a global system built on unequal rules. This chapter is where the silent plunder becomes visible, not through spectacle, but through consequence. Where the abstract language of credits and balances turns into lived hardship. Where the question is no longer whether India is contributing, but whether it's being used. The war exposes the truth at its core. Britain fights with borrowed time and borrowed money. India provides both, without the ability to say no. That realization will not fade when the war ends. It will shape everything that follows. The system has reached its breaking point. The illusion of shared sacrifice is gone. What remains is a reckoning delayed, but no longer avoidable. When the war finally ends, the silence breaks. The guns fall quiet, but the numbers remain. Britain emerges victorious, yet visibly exhausted. Its cities are damaged. Its finances are strained. Its empire, once projected as unshakable, now rests on fragile foundations. The deferred cost of the war can no longer be hidden behind emergency language. The bills are coming due, and at the center of those bills sit the enormous balances accumulated in India's name. On paper, India appears wealthy. Years of wartime credits have piled up into staggering figures. But in practice, The country is financially distorted. Inflation has weakened purchasing power. Infrastructure has been overused without adequate reinvestment. Food systems are fragile. Industrial growth is uneven and dependent. The wealth exists, but it is frozen, constrained by negotiations, conditions, and political leverage. The post-war period becomes a struggle over settlement. Britain cannot easily repay what it owes. Doing so would strain its own recovery. Delay, once justified by war, now continues under the language of negotiation. Timelines stretch. Conditions multiply. What was once temporary begins to look permanent. Resentment grows, not only because of delay, but because of what the delay represents. Control still lies elsewhere. Independence follows soon after, but freedom arrives carrying the weight of these unresolved distortions. Political sovereignty is achieved faster than economic repair. The new nation inherits systems shaped by extraction, agricultural vulnerabilities, industrial gaps, limited reserves. These are not accidents of transition. They are the accumulated outcome of years when economic decisions were made without local control. There is no single moment that marks the loss, no dramatic collapse. That is what makes the story easy to overlook. The damage is gradual, layered, and structural. It builds through policies described as necessary, through delays described as reasonable, through promises described as inevitable. By the time the full cost is visible, the mechanism that caused it is already normalized. This is the aftermath of silent plunder. A nation that helped finance a global victory begins its independent life, constrained by the very systems that sustained that victory. The war is remembered for its battles and turning points. The economic war that ran alongside it is rarely discussed, yet its consequences last far longer. The lesson extends beyond this moment in history. Power does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives with contracts, currency rules, and delayed settlements. Sometimes exploitation hides behind complexity, behind emergencies, behind claims that there is no alternative. Look at the modern world. Debt dependencies, trade imbalances, frozen reserves, financial pressure applied without a single shot fired. Different era, same logic. Control over money remains control over outcomes. The story of India during World War II is not only about the past. It is a warning written in ledgers rather than blood. Wealth can be drained quietly. Sovereignty can be weakened politely. And history often remembers the battles, while forgetting the books where the real war was decided. If this story changed how you see power, history, and economics, subscribe for more documentaries that uncover the forces beneath the surface. And share this story, because some wars are only understood when they are finally told.